Good afternoon. We're going to give people a few minutes to join us before we get started. So to ensure that we have ample time for today's conversation, my name is Deborah Levine. I am the Community Engagement Officer for the City University Graduate School of Public Health and Health Policy. And welcome to all who are joining us today for the Cannabis Corner Webinar series. This is episode 2, and it will look at the cannabis history and our practices across industry. Just wanted to say that we're very grateful for the partnerships and for you joining us today. Our featured speaker today is Cecilia, excuse me, who is the Deputy Director in Labor Employment Law Program at the Cornell University School of Industry and Labor Relations. Next slide. So really quickly, for those who are joining us and have not been with us previously, we're using a new function on our webinar. It's called the Q&A function. And for those that would like to add questions during the presentation, please feel free to use your indicator to pull up the toolbar at the bottom. You'll see there's a Q&A that's circled in green. You can click on that and type your question in, or you can use the QR codes on the sides, and you just need to put your phone in that direction. It will give you a link and you can put your question in there and also answer the poll. And as you see, for those that are in Zoom, the poll is up and we'd love to know what brings you here today. And who we are talking to. This information really helps us to be able to better understand who the audience is and how we can better serve you. Next slide. So today we will, before I go any further, let me just stop 1 second and thank our sponsors, community boards from Manhattan 9, 10, 11. Miss Mixxy, we appreciate your ongoing support, along with the New York Canna Chamber of Commerce, who have supported us in this work. So thank you very much, and we appreciate your ongoing support in this process. So as you see, the agenda is on the screen. We are going to have the presentation, and then we will move into Q&A and some quick takeaways. I also want to remind folks that we have continuing education credits, and that at the end of this presentation today, you will receive an email that will have some resources, the link for this recording, where you will also be able to listen and share, and also be able to apply for continuing education credits once you finish the webinar. Next slide. So just so that we're clear, we want everyone to know what the learning objectives are. We're going to be looking at a historical timeline of the cultural impacts of cannabis in the United States. We'll be summarizing some of the key milestones as it relates to the history of cannabis culture and some notable events. By the end of this presentation, you'll also be able to identify factors that have influenced the development of the American cannabis industry, evaluate the economic and social implications of American cannabis industry, while also being able to describe the relationship between cannabis policies, cultures, perceptions, and the industry growth. Also looking at the significance of recent cannabis legislation in New York State's MARTR and an overview of its impact on workforce. So those will be some of the objectives along with a few others, and you will see those. And again, just being mindful that the QR code is there for you to be able to use for the Q&A. Next slide. So without further ado, I'm going to decrease to allow our presenter to increase and be able to carry the conversation. It is truly an honor and a privilege to have Cecilia come and join us today as she shares her knowledge around the work. And so we will stay there. Thank you, and join us, Cecilia.
Great. Thank you so much, Deborah, and to the School of Public Health, Harlem Health Initiative for having me. I'm really excited to be here with you all this afternoon to discuss the legalization of cannabis. Let me go ahead and share my slides here with you all. Let's do that. Okay, hopefully everyone can see my screen well. Great. So often when people think of the legalization of cannabis,
So you may just want to go into presentation mode.
Oh, sure. Let's see. Oh, it looks like it's in presentation mode in my end, but let me try it again. All right, I'm gonna try one more time.
No problem.
Is this better?
We don't see your screen.
Okay. Let me see. Let me try again. Let me stop sharing and try again. Oops. Oh, you know what? Sorry, now the presentation is for some reason. Try this again. Can you see it now?
There you go. You're good.
Okay, perfect. Wonderful. Sorry about that.
That's okay. That's why it's called collaboration. We work together on this.
Right. And
Please,
of course,
go
it
ahead.
worked perfectly fine during the tech run, but you know, live, that's when it wants to give me trouble.
Okay.
But thank you all for your patience and grace with that. So often when people think of the legalization of cannabis and public health, it's really with the lens of cannabis as medicine or regulating cannabis in a way that protects public health and safety. So for example, requiring products to be lab tested, free of contaminants, properly labeled, etc. And while cannabis's therapeutic properties are well documented, the legalization of cannabis extends beyond just its medicinal applications or consumer safety when it comes to public health. And we at CWI believe that it really serves as a potent tool for public health by mitigating the harms associated with criminalization. So by legalizing cannabis, we're not just opening pathways to medical treatment, we're also keeping individuals out of jails and prisons and dismantling the disproportionate impact of cannabis-related arrests on marginalized communities and creating opportunities for employment and economic growth. So in essence, cannabis legalization is a holistic approach to public health, and it's one that fosters healthier individuals and communities by addressing systemic injustices, promoting social equity, and providing avenues for economic empowerment. Now, you may have also wondered why marijuana has become increasingly referred to as cannabis, and why we're called the Cannabis Workforce Initiative and not the Marijuana Workforce Initiative. And so while the two terms are still used interchangeably within the industry and throughout this presentation, the industry really has been increasingly moving away from the use of the term marijuana because of its racist overtones. Historically, the term marijuana was used by racist and xenophobic politicians who deliberately tried to reinforce the plant's foreign identity to stigmatize and racialize the plant, even though it was used in the country for many, many years. And so for many people, the term marijuana is a reminder of that racial prejudice that led to the targeting of and criminalization of marginalized communities. And so you'll find that the legalization movement is really trying to kind of move away from the use of that term due to its negative connotations. So before we dive into the meat of the presentation, I'd just like to tell you more about our mission at the Cannabis Workforce Initiative, which is to promote and support social equity in the adult use cannabis market by providing quality workforce development training and legal education. And we do this by partnering with community-based organizations, academic institutions like CUNY, and elected officials to provide our free training and resources, right? Everybody loves free, and that's really one of the best parts of our programming is that we're funded by the New York State Legislature. So all of the programming we offer to participants is free of charge. And in a nutshell, we teach people how to get and keep their jobs and grow their businesses. So just a quick overview of the agenda. We'll start with an overview of the history of cannabis laws, and then we'll talk about some employment laws that are related to cannabis use and legal protections for justice-involved individuals generally. And as you'll learn in this presentation, the cannabis legalization effort in New York really was a social justice goal to reverse the harm caused by the war on drugs. And one of the ways that the state wants to do this is by creating good job opportunities in the cannabis industry for those who were disproportionately impacted by cannabis enforcement. And we believe that this can be achieved by ensuring that cannabis employers and employees have a fair and equitable relationship. So just to kind of set the stage, cannabis, whether for medical or recreational use, remains illegal under federal law. And although the federal government really started regulating marijuana more aggressively in the 1930s, the harsh criminalization of cannabis really began during the presidency of Richard Nixon. Tricky Dick, as he's also referred to. And before we go into more detail about Nixon, I just want to share some additional history about cannabis prohibition. So the federal government first started regulating marijuana in 1937 when Congress passed the Marijuana Tax Act. And this law was drafted by Harry J. Anslinger, who was the then commissioner of the Federal Bureau of Narcotics, which was the predecessor agency to the current Drug Enforcement Administration, the DEA. And it's really Anslinger who's credited with being the first architect of the war on drugs. And the Marijuana Tax Act effectively made cannabis illegal by imposing an extremely high tax to deter its sale and possession. And Anslinger really pushed this law by launching a successful political campaign to really demonize the cannabis plant and spread a public perception that there were connections between cannabis and violent crime by people of color. And so guided by Anslinger's direction, a lot of states also started passing their own laws or adopting more stringent versions of the federal laws relating to cannabis. And interestingly enough, at the time, the only authoritative voice that really opposed Anslinger's campaign against cannabis was none other than New York's mayor of Fiorello, I always butcher his first name, LaGuardia, who appointed a commission to actually review the effects of marijuana. And that commission actually found that, contrary to the claims used to justify prohibition, marijuana use did not induce violence, insanity, or crime, or lead to addiction or other drug use. Unfortunately, those findings were ignored, and enforcement around cannabis continued in New York and beyond. And so by the 1950s, nearly all states had anti-drug laws in place. And when Nixon came into office, he really leaned into pushing a law and order anti-drug agenda. And he declared drugs as America's public enemy #1, and that formally gave birth to the war on drugs. And Nixon really targeted cannabis to target his political enemies. Because after the Civil Rights Act got passed in 1964, the administration was facing increasing pressure to really live up to the promises of the Civil Rights Act and to live up to those promises of equality. And there was also the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which opened up equal access to voting to people of color. And so Nixon used cannabis as a way to criminalize his anti-Vietnam War protesters and people of color so that they wouldn't be able to sway the country against the war or in support of civil rights. The Controlled Substances Act. So cannabis was officially outlawed for any use, including medical, with the passage of the Controlled Substances Act in 1970, and that was under the Nixon administration. And so since then, federal law has classified cannabis as a Schedule I drug under the Act. So this means that its possession is almost entirely banned except for very limited research purposes and on the federal level. And this classification is the same of that of heroin and LSD. And essentially Schedule I is reserved for drugs that the federal government has deemed to have no legitimate medical uses and a high likelihood of abuse. Now, this classification is not truly based on scientific or medical opinion, but instead it really stems from political motivation, right? And unfortunately, the Nixon administration's hatred towards groups that he associated with marijuana. And so it was really the enforcement of this act that led to mass incarceration, which has primarily impacted communities of color. And the act has not truly been effective in preventing the growth and sale of marijuana. And in fact, the unregulated market expanded after its passage. And we've seen that states have, within their own jurisdictions, legalized cannabis, right? New York being one of them. And one thing that I do want to note that's not on the slide is some recent developments with regards to the CSA that you might have heard about. So although cannabis is still federally illegal and a Schedule I drug under the Act, in August of 2023, the Health and Human Services Administration wrote a letter recommending that cannabis be rescheduled to Schedule III. And that's for controlled substances that are drugs with more of a moderate to low potential for physical and psychological dependence. So essentially, it would still be regulated by the federal government and only legally available by prescription if rescheduled to Schedule III. And so a lot of people have criticisms about this because rescheduling cannabis would not really close this gap that we have between state law and federal marijuana policy. Because even though all these states have legalized, the federal government still really does have the authority to shut this whole thing down. Now they haven't, and there are a couple reasons for that. On the medical side, there was an amendment to a appropriations bill that has continued through the different sessions of Congress since, that essentially says that the federal government will not use any funding to go after state medical programs, right? So that kind of offers a little bit of protection for state medical cannabis programs. On the recreational side, really the only thing that's the federal prosecutors really have authority within their own jurisdictions to target marijuana if they want. However, essentially, thanks to a memo that came out during the Obama administration, which said that the federal government isn't really going to use its resources for the DEA to target legal cannabis programs as long as the states are making sure that people are not selling cannabis across state lines or to minors or involving gangs and violence and all of that. So that's kind of where we are now, right? But rescheduling to Schedule III would still make it technically federally regulated, right? And federally illegal. But it would provide some benefits to the industry. So providing more avenues for research and also allowing cannabis businesses to deduct their business expenses from federal taxes. So in terms of where we're at with that, ultimately the DEA has final say as to whether cannabis will be rescheduled or descheduled entirely. But for now, it's still a Schedule I drug and thus federally illegal. So just to get back to the history a bit, so after the passage of the Controlled Substances Act, many states followed the federal government's strict anti-drug stance, including New York. And under the Rockefeller administration, the Rockefeller drug laws were passed, which outlawed the use and distribution of cannabis as well as other drugs. And these were really some of the most severe drug laws in the country and were really a major reason for increased incarceration in New York until they were repealed in 2009. And these laws imposed mandatory 15 years to life sentences for possessing small amounts of cannabis. And so what that meant is that judges who heard these cases really had no ability to give anything less than the minimum sentence. They couldn't look at extenuating circumstances or other issues, and nothing in these laws really provided treatment if someone was addicted to drugs like heroin, for example. And so unfortunately, the racial impact of these laws is that men of color went to prison in much greater numbers than white men. And so the laws were repealed in 2009, but by then the damage had really been done in terms of incarceration and its impact on certain communities, its long-term impacts. But eventually New York, like other states, began to take steps to legalize cannabis, starting with the passage of the Compassionate Care Act in 2014, which legalized cannabis for medicinal use. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later on. So laws like the Rockefeller drug laws led to staggering rates of incarceration, both on the state and federal level. So as a result of the war on drugs, by the end of 2015, we had over 7 million people under the supervision of adult correctional systems, and people of color were disproportionately affected by this. And we provided some stats here just to show you like the staggering impact, right? So from 1960 to 2008, the number of people behind bars grew an unprecedented 700%, which is just mind-blowing. And by the end of 2015, as I mentioned before, we had approximately 7 million people under supervision of adult correctional systems. So think of the impact on that. Think of the impact of that on the individuals, their families, and their communities. And in some states, incarceration rates for Black males were 20 to 50 times greater than white males. And even though Black and Latinx represent approximately 30% of the population, they comprise over half of those incarcerated. And Black males are 5 to 7 times more likely to be convicted compared to white males, right? So this inequality was really a major driving force for the legalization of cannabis in New York. Just some more statistics here to really hammer home the point. 1 in 3 adults in the US have a criminal record. And even though the US has less than 5% of the world's population, it has a fifth of its prisoners. And as I've said many, many times in this presentation, a disproportionate share of those prisoners are people of color. And again, why is this important? What does this have to do with public health? Well, it's important because these criminal records not only impact the individual, but also families and communities. Having a criminal record often creates barriers to employment, and to economic and educational opportunities. And these barriers are really the collateral consequences of incarceration. And so fortunately, New York has passed laws that have tried to remove some of these barriers, and we'll talk about them a little later on. So we'll get into sort of the beginning of legalization here now. So fast forward to 2014, and New York officially recognizes the medicinal benefits of cannabis with the passage of the Compassionate Care Act. And, we know now that people with certain health conditions can really benefit from cannabis use. And really through the work of advocates and the medical community, it became clear that cannabis could really help people. And so there was a major effort for the legislature to establish a medical cannabis program. And initially, the program was actually really restrictive. It only applied to a limited number of medical conditions. It was limited to a 30-day supply of cannabis at a time. It also prohibited patients from cultivating cannabis at home, which is no longer the case for medical patients in New York. And fortunately, the medical program was expanded more under the Marijuana Regulation Taxation Act, which we'll talk a bit more about later, so that now it's less restrictive. And it's increased patient supply from 30 to 60 days. Now patients can buy wholesale flower. It makes it easier to register for the program. And as I mentioned before, allows medical patients to grow at home now. And then on the federal level, there was also the Farm Bill, which was passed in 2018, and that removed hemp as a controlled substance. So that's why you really saw around that time the proliferation of the CBD and hemp industry, including in New York. So let's just pause, because I know that was a lot of information, and just review some of the key takeaways that we've discussed so far. So the first is that the federal and state governments criminalized cannabis, even though they were aware of its economic value and medicinal benefits. And the efforts to prohibit the sale of and possession of cannabis are linked to economic and racial motives that resulted in the disproportionate incarceration of communities of color. And so this is really why New York is really trying to create the legal cannabis market in the way that it is, to try to prioritize those who were most harmed by cannabis prohibition, to really help address those harms that really hit those communities very hard and continues to have lasting impacts. So here we are, the Marijuana Regulation Taxation Act. So on March 31st, 2021, New York passed the MRTA, also referred to as MRTA, used interchangeably. And this legalizes the cultivation, processing, distribution, and sale of adult use cannabis, which means cannabis that's used for non-medical or recreational purposes. And as I mentioned, the MRTA expanded the medical program, and the major driving force was really to deal with mass incarceration and the fact that the war on drugs took more of a toll on people of color. And a lot of the goal here was to really help people shed the stigma that they've had with cannabis convictions, to be able to find jobs or build their own businesses. And one of the ways that New York is trying to accomplish that is by awarding, or by having a goal that within the law, that 50% of the licenses, at least 50% of the licenses, will be granted to social equity applicants. And this is very unique. Many states that have legalized cannabis did not really place equity at the forefront in the way that New York did in its legislation, right? But licensing is just one part of the picture. The MRTA also has a major impact on some of the state's labor and employment laws. And as a result, the rights and responsibilities of employers and employees. One of the things that the MRTA did to try to help people shed the stigma of cannabis convictions is through expungement, the expungement of low-level cannabis convictions, which I'll talk more about. And this is really significant because it means you don't have to list the expunged conviction on a job application if you've been convicted or arrested. And the law also amended labor law so that now employers generally cannot take action against employees for recreational use outside of the workplace. But the key is outside of the workplace, which we'll talk more about later on. And there are some exceptions to that. So, and another thing that's unique about the MRTA is that it's really set up to allow employees to decide whether or not they want to join a union. Because all cannabis license holders are required to enter into what's called a labor peace agreement, which provides the ability for a union campaign to take place by requiring employers to remain neutral. And in return, the union agrees not to strike or boycott during that process. So this really gives the opportunity for employees to use their voice and exercise their right to organize a union without fear of retaliation from the employer. So the Office of Cannabis Management is the agency that regulates and controls all cannabis businesses in New York State, from cultivation, processing, manufacturing, distribution, even transportation, retail, all of it. that is under the purview of the OCM. And it also has a control board, the Cannabis Control Board, that approves licenses. And there's also an advisory board that will help determine how to allocate the cannabis tax dollars across communities, right? And the goal is to help communities, especially those that have been disproportionately harmed, by providing community services using the money from the cannabis taxes. And so the Office of Cannabis Management also provides information regarding regulations for the industry. They set the standards for the industry and issue licenses. And they also advise about the legality of certain practices as it relates to cannabis. So now we'll transition to the employment laws related to cannabis use and justice-involved job seekers, because these are really the questions that we want people to ask themselves if they're interested in, once they decide that they're interested in getting a job in the industry or want to own a business. And, hopefully they're successful in those endeavors. But it's important to really know when you're entering, a workspace or beginning to run your own workspace, what the rights and responsibilities are. And, when a situation arises, what information would you like to know? And, before acting, who you should seek advice from. And so these are the questions that we'll answer by the end of the session. And our hope is that we're really equipping you with some helpful knowledge to assist members of the Harlem community who are cannabis users or may fall into the justice-involved category, right? So what can a person do if they have a New York State criminal record related to cannabis? Can employees be discriminated against or harassed for having a criminal record? What information about criminal records can be asked on applications? Can an employer do a background check for criminal records? Can employees use cannabis at work? Can they use it outside of work? When can employees be drug tested? But before we get into these questions, it's really important to understand how the law is structured. And at the bottom of the law is, at the bottom of the triangle is federal law. And federal law in many ways sets the standard for a law, but it's not just limited to federal law, right? So for example, as I mentioned earlier, the Controlled Substances Act. Cannabis is still a Schedule I drug, which means that it's technically illegal to grow, distribute, and sell as it pertains on the federal level. But we have state laws, right? Like in New York that we just covered, that have legalized cannabis within their own borders. And then you can have local laws that improve upon federal and state laws. So one thing we'll talk about here is that New York City prohibits employers from asking about conviction history before making a job offer. But that rule doesn't apply to all of New York State. And all of this involves agencies who interpret and enforce the laws and create regulations based on those laws, right? So we talked about the Marijuana Taxation Act, which is the state law in New York, and the Office of Cannabis Management, which is tasked with interpreting the law and setting up regulations for that law. And then sometimes the law is challenged and it goes to court, and then there's judge-made law in terms of how the courts interpret the law and how it should be implemented. There are also agreements, such as employment agreements or collective bargaining agreements, which also give more rights than the law. And just for your edification, a collective bargaining agreement is a written agreement that is the result of a negotiation process between an employer and a union to create an agreement that will govern the terms and conditions of the worker's employment. And then in addition, an employer can give greater rights if they choose by implementing policies and practices. And so those are two approaches for getting greater rights that we like to emphasize in our classes. So just to summarize some of the key points here, there are numerous federal, state, and local laws that protect employees. And you always want to think about federal law as the floor, and you get better protections from New York State. And sometimes cities like New York City add on additional laws that also must be followed. Collective bargaining agreements can give greater rights and really outline the terms and conditions of employment. So from promotions to wages to sick leave. And then one of the really important things to emphasize is that the law is constantly changing. And so we really encourage people to seek advice and think about what the possibilities are in terms of legal consequences before acting. So we're also going to talk more about the impact of cannabis legalization on the workplace. As I mentioned, the MRTA legalizes adult use cannabis for adults over 21. It also amended New York State labor law so that now employers can't discriminate against employees who use cannabis outside of the workplace. It also provides for expungement of misdemeanor cannabis convictions. And then there's also the fair chance hiring, which makes it illegal for most employers in New York City to ask about the criminal record of job applicants before making a job offer. And then we'll also talk a little bit more about drug testing, which is a tricky area because cannabis stays in your system for like months. So a drug test doesn't really tell employers when you actually really engaged in recreational activity involving cannabis. So we expect actually there to be a lot of litigation around this, which could actually lead to judge-made law about it. Oops. So just to get into expungement, one of the most important pieces of the MRTA is this expungement piece, which happened automatically under the law. And so what does that mean? It means that expungement means that a person is restored to the status that they were before the offense was committed. So it's not available to employers to find out or credit card agencies that do background checks to find out if you've had this specific conviction that has been expunged. And so that's really like the first step to addressing the harms caused by cannabis prohibition and mass incarceration. And so it means that your record is sealed and just not available for most civil purposes. So it won't appear in background checks and can't be used against the person whose record has been expunged. And people can see it if a person applies for a gun license or a law enforcement job. So there is that exception. But it's really meant to help people get better access to jobs, education, and housing. And how it's done is that it's all really done electronically. It's not completely gone. It's sort of marked as expunged in the system. And you can legally answer no when asked if you have a New York cannabis criminal record on a job application or during an interview or during the employment process. But it's really important to note that the expungement law in the MRTA only applies to New York State cannabis convictions. It does not apply to convictions in other states or for non-cannabis convictions in New York or other states. It also doesn't apply to federal convictions. So if you have a federal offense, even if it's related to cannabis, that will still be on your record. So you would still have to technically answer yes. Or if they have any other convictions that apply to these categories that haven't been expunged, they would not be able to answer no if asked if they have a criminal record. So really important thing to note there. There's also a new law that Governor Hochul signed called the Clean Slate Act that applies to other expungement of misdemeanor and some felony convictions. So under this law, a person's conviction will be automatically sealed after a waiting period, which is 8 years for a felony and 3 years for a misdemeanor. So during this time, a person can have no other convictions. And once the waiting period's over, the conviction will be sealed if that person's no longer under probation or parole and they have no pending criminal cases either. So, and there are some convictions that can never be sealed, like sex offenses and Class A felonies and so on and so forth. So who's eligible for expungement under the MRTA? A person is eligible for expungement if they were convicted of possessing up to 16 ounces of marijuana or selling up to 25 grams before March 31st, 2021, which is the date that the MRTA was signed into law. So if a person was convicted of higher amounts than that threshold, they would have to file a motion with the court in order to have it expunged. It wouldn't fall into the automatic process. And this process is managed by the Office of Court Administration, which identifies the eligible records for expungement. And it's a free and automatic process. And all cannabis records that were eligible should have been expunged by March 31st, 2023. So that deadline has passed. One flaw in this system is that a person whose cannabis record has been expunged is not automatically notified. So the document that provides a written record that the conviction was expunged is called a certificate of disposition. And a person can request a certificate of disposition from the original court where the case was decided. And you just go to the clerk of that court and they'll provide the certificate. But there's usually like a small nominal fee, just bearing that in mind. We also do tell people that if you have warrants, don't go to the court because then you will probably get arrested. So you got to kind of weigh whether it's worth trying to get the certificate of disposition if you may have warrants, which is just, you know, practical advice that we like to give people. So this is the overview of the employment laws that we'll be covering that impact cannabis users and the justice involved. And so we have employment laws in the state that say that people can't be discriminated against for having a criminal record when it comes to employment. You know, and so the question kind of becomes, where in the hiring process can a person be asked about their criminal records? So in New York City, it's illegal for most employers to ask about that before making a conditional job offer. So that means ads, applications, interview questions can't include inquiries into an applicant's criminal record, because the goal here is to allow applicants to be judged on their qualifications. This is just a slide that talks about what's on a rap sheet, arrests, convictions, court case information, information about where a person was incarcerated, any licenses that they've held, their parole information, probation, any certificates earned while incarcerated, since we know that there are many programs within prisons where you can get education and certificates. So why do we care so much about expungement? Because it's really a game changer. We know that employers are often very reluctant to hire people with a criminal record. And, you know, so here we have a whole list of biases that they often worry about when hiring people with criminal records. Theft at the workplace, even though there's been studies that have shown that there's actually no correlation to increased theft when hiring people with a criminal record. Lawsuits, you know, employers are worried about what are called negligent hiring lawsuits. So, you know, if I'm an employer and I hire someone with a criminal record and that person hurts another employee or customer or vendor, then I will be sued for negligent hiring because I shouldn't have hired that person in the first place. That's a common bias that employers have when it comes to hiring people who have records. But there's actually no relationship between hiring someone with a record and a problem in the workplace. We've seen no uptick in negligent hiring lawsuits, so it's not really a fear grounded in reality. We'll also talk more about Corrections Law 23A, which gives employers a list of criteria to evaluate if and there is someone who they interview who they then find out after a conditional offer has been given that has a criminal record. So that actually resolves them or absolves the employer in terms of negligent hiring, because they really have kind of done all the steps to make sure that that person is appropriate for the workplace. High turnover, but there's no research that shows that if you hire someone that they're going to leave quickly. In fact, the opposite is true. Work ethic, reliability, there's no connection to work ethic and having a criminal record. You know, there's this idea that the person will miss days, not come in, not be reliable, but those are myths just based on biases. Recidivism, but we've seen that having a job is directly related to decreasing the likelihood of you going back to prison. So again, not a bias really grounded in reality. And then coworker bias, but the fact that someone has a criminal record shouldn't be disclosed to fellow coworkers anyway, because it's not really their business. So in order to address the potential bias for people or against people with criminal records in the initial phase for jobs or initial screening phase for jobs, some cities have enacted what are called ban the box laws. And you might have heard of this. There was a big campaign and push for this a few years ago. And the purpose of these laws is to give someone who does have a record, a foot in the door. And so the idea is that you're increasing the chance that an employee who has a record will be seen in a favorable light by the employer before the employer finds out that they have a record, right? So it's supposed to help people with getting a job. New York State overall doesn't have a ban the box law. Instead, there are different cities within New York State that do. So New York City, Buffalo, Rochester, Yonkers are some examples. And where there is a ban the box law, they kind of differ on where in the process you can ask someone after that initial phase about their criminal record. So, at the appropriate time, depending on what it says under the local laws, employers can ask applicants about their criminal record and their circumstances around that record or conduct a background check. But what's really important here is that the person has gotten their foot in the door past the initial screening phase so that they at least have an opportunity to interview and discuss their skills and what they bring to the position. So New York laws vary on when an employer can ask about a criminal record. So in some places, an employer can actually ask about it during the interview, after they reviewed the application, in other parts of the state at the end of the interview, or after they give a conditional offer of employment. So conditional offer of employment essentially means, if I'm an employer and I interview you, I think you're great, I'm interested in hiring you, I'll tell you I'm going to give you this job, but it's conditioned upon a background screening being done. And so essentially, I'm going to go to a credit reporting agency and get information about your background. So that's what a conditional offer of employment is. Quick note about background checks. So if the employer requests to do a background check, that's really the Fair Credit Reporting Act that comes into play. And the employer is required to get written permission from the applicant prior to running the background check. And the applicant has the right to say no, but bearing in mind that they also may not get the job. So, if a person submits to a background check and they don't get the job because of the information, they do have a right to get a copy of the background report, and they have 60 days to correct any inaccuracies. But unfortunately, there's no requirement that the job actually be held open, except under certain circumstances. So under New York State law, as I mentioned, Corrections Law 23A, if it comes back that a person has a criminal record, an employer cannot deny employment based solely on the criminal record. And so by law, New York employers must consider several factors when determining whether or not to hire someone for having a criminal record. And so it really is trying to require the employer to do the work of thinking about what the actual skills and responsibilities of the job are and be clear about what it requires and, whether that person is qualified. Job relatedness is one of the factors that they have to consider. So we encourage people in our classes, to really think about that. If you were convicted for animal cruelty, don't apply for a job as a vet tech, that sort of thing, because there's a direct relationship between the offense you committed and the job. Employers are also required to consider things like the amount of time that's passed. If the offense happened like 20 years ago and nothing's happened since, right? How old was the applicant when the offense was committed? Were they 17? We've all made dumb decisions as teenagers, right? And it shouldn't be held against us for the rest of our lives. How serious was the offense? If the person has references that they can give, all of these things need to be looked at. So these are just factors that employers really need to keep in mind when going through the process of interviewing and hiring people with criminal records. So in summary, these are the laws that we really want people to be aware of because they give good context for what protections are available, whether it be for you or someone under the law. So Title VII of the Civil Rights Act, which outlaws discrimination. It outlaws discrimination based on race, sex, natural origin, gender, religion, ethnicity. But notice how I didn't say criminal record, right? So think back to the triangle. The federal Title VII Civil Rights Act only protects certain classes, but New York has more expansive protections. And they do outlaw criminal discrimination based on criminal records. And then there's, again, Corrections Law 23A, which we just discussed, which basically says to employers, listen, we want you to give people who have been in the criminal legal system a fair shot. And you can't discriminate against them or if you refuse to hire them just because they've been in the criminal legal system, right? Drug testing. So employers are prohibited from drug testing employees for cannabis unless they're required to do so through federal law, or they have like federal contracts or anything like that. Because generally the law allows employers to require employees to be drug tested. However, in New York, if you're required to submit to a drug test, a lot of the drug testing panels often include cannabis, but if it comes back positive for cannabis, an employer can't take an adverse action against that employee for testing positive, unless the employee displays what are called articulable behaviors of impairment on the job, or as I mentioned, if the employer is required to drug test for cannabis pursuant to federal laws or restrictions. And one of the things we really want to make clear when we talk about this is the use of cannabis outside of work versus at work. Because even though in New York, employers can't discriminate against employees for using cannabis outside of the workplace, it can't be used during work. It has to be used outside of work hours and without the use of employer property or equipment. So from the time a person gets to their employer's premises to the time they leave, they can't use it during their lunch breaks or anything like that. And just to kind of get back into history mode of how we kind of got into this drug testing world in the first place, we have Ronald Reagan to thank for that, who became president in 1981 and really continued to carry that mantle from the Nixon administration of anti-drugs. And he really was obsessed with cannabis, and it was really cannabis that he targeted heavily. And that was the first time that a president of the United States required all civilian employees of the federal government to be drug tested for cannabis, right? And so as a result of that, drug testing started to really creep into the employment world since the federal government was doing it for their employees. And so that's kind of how we got into this place of hyper drug testing today. And fortunately, we're seeing more and more legalization of cannabis in various states. And as a result of that, drug testing as it relates to cannabis sort of loosening a bit. So just a quick review of some of the things that we've talked about. So we talked about expungement, about how it's an automatic process for certain eligible cannabis convictions, and how really the goal is to help people with a criminal record get a foot in the door. And, we have employment laws in the state that say that people can't be discriminated against for having a criminal record. And there are different restrictions when it comes to the hiring process and when a person can be asked about their criminal record, depending on the city. And in New York City, it's illegal for most employers to ask about a criminal record of job applicants before making a job offer. And in terms of cannabis use at work and outside of work, employers cannot discriminate against employees using cannabis outside of the workplace, as long as they're using it outside of work hours and without the use of employer property or equipment. And again, an employer can't screen potential employees for cannabis as a condition of employment, which means that a person can't be drug tested for cannabis in order to apply for or obtain a job, although they still can be screened for other drugs. So just to summarize, these are some of the key points to remember. So federal, New York State, and local laws set the minimum protection for employees, and collective bargaining agreements and employer policies and practices can really provide employees with greater rights, protections, and benefits. And the law is constantly changing. So especially in the cannabis world, things are in New York, since it's a new market, things are developing really quickly, and things are changing left and right. So we really encourage people to seek advice from experts and really think about what the possibilities are in terms of legal consequences before acting. So lastly, good jobs are essential for healthy communities. They're essential for healthy communities, strong local economies, thriving businesses, and individual and family well-being. Just to really tie it back to the public health component, right? So one of the things that we really encourage with our trainings is to go beyond the law and really try to follow best practices, for those individuals who are interested in owning a cannabis businesses, so that their workplace is fair and equitable, because that's what we really want to see the cannabis industry be, an industry where employees are treated with respect, where all identities are included and have a voice, and employees are affirmed for the work that they do, and they have good benefits, right? Good healthcare benefits, and are compensated well. So that's really the aim that we really try to emphasize with our work at CWI. So with that, I'll stop there and open it up for questions.
Cecilia, thank you. I can't say that I've had the opportunity to hear such an in-depth sort of review of the history of how we got here. And so I just want to remind folks that you can use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen to drop questions in. We do have some questions for you. And again, I just want to thank you, because I think that's really helpful in helping us think through where we've been and where we're going, because without knowing our history, it's sort of hard to plot where we're going. So a few questions. The first one that's come in is, when considering the economic implications of the American cannabis industry, how do we ensure equitable access and opportunities for marginalized communities, particularly those disproportionately affected by past drug policies?
Great question. It really starts with having a strong law. So really pushing the legislature, and the governor to get on board. And, I will say New York has really, it started off really setting the bar in that way. There have been, it's been a bumpy ride, a bumpy rollout, but I think with the Marijuana Regulation and Taxation Act, that was a piece of legislation that really tried to get these components. I will say, I think one of the things that's really important to advocate for in this space is for capital and access to capital for social equity, because that's the biggest challenge, given that it's such a highly regulated industry. Especially, it takes a lot of money to get up and running. And so, especially in a time when private investment in cannabis is sort of, it's rough right now, it's really driving up. It really is the state's responsibility to help provide, maybe it's low interest loans, grants to entrepreneurs from these communities that have been impacted, especially because I'm of the opinion that since it was, the state and the localities locking up people for cannabis, that they really should be the ones driving to make sure that, if they're not going to cut checks for reparations, that, they're giving people at least the opportunity to have a way to generate wealth and income for their families.
Thank you. So we have another question as it relates to that. Something for you to sort of think about is, what role does the grassroots movement or advocacy effects play in sort of shaping both cannabis policy and societal norms? And how has those sort of movements evolved over time? So like, what have you seen in terms of that? Because I know you raised the whole issue around President Nixon. So from this sort of perspective to now, what are you seeing?
Yeah, I mean, I think, well, the advocacy, the local grassroots movement is extremely important. It's how we got here. I think it took a lot of people mobilizing from different groups and different interests, right? So, you have on the medical side, people advocating, for example, on behalf of veterans who, having access to cannabis can help with PTSD and, substance use disorder and things like that. So I think you have a lot of people approaching it from that lens. But then you also have people who from the drug reform, side of things, trying to get people out of jail for this, it shouldn't be illegal, that sort of thing, really coming together to push for legalization. It's been a really long fight. And I think, a lot of advocates are tired, but still fighting the good fight. Even in DC now, this week is, Cannabis Week, and there's a lot of movement and push to really get things moving on the federal level, because I think that's where a lot of attention is now. Given that we have a Democratic president, really trying to capitalize on that and get as much movement as we can on the federal level, because the federal illegality is what is one of the things that, or if not the thing, that makes it an incredibly challenging industry. And if it's challenging for the people who have access to capital, you can imagine for those who don't. So, I think we all have an interest in getting cannabis to be legal on the federal level, because that would really, really help on so many levels. So I think we're still seeing a really strong push for that from the advocacy community.
Thank you. So you have another question that's come in, and the question speaks to, you raised the issue around rescheduling versus descheduling. Can you talk a little bit more about what that is and what would be the implications for a business?
So one of the major implications is that in terms of taxes, and one of the reasons it's so expensive to have a cannabis business is because, as an ordinary business, you're allowed to deduct your business expenses. But since cannabis is still federally illegal, there's a provision in the tax code 280E, which prevents cannabis businesses, even if they're operating in legal, state legal market, from deducting those expenses. So that would go away under rescheduling. Now, the issue with rescheduling is that it wouldn't eliminate a lot of the criminal penalties for cannabis that we see. So that's one of the things that it really just doesn't go far enough in terms of, for the communities that have been disproportionately impacted, making sure that they're more protected, right? So that's one of the things that's challenging, is if it's just rescheduled, then, it doesn't really kind of remove that criminal component. And then the other factor is that, which is still kind of being figured out, is what exactly, if it's rescheduled to Schedule 3, will the FDA play in that? Our business is now going to be required to kind of move to more of a like pharmacy model. What does that mean? Because that's going to be a whole other, could be potentially, a whole nother hurdle for people, who are coming into this industry who don't have a lot of resources, to now have to, compete with businesses that can afford to be compliant with all of that. So that's another kind of area that we have, our eye on when it comes to this rescheduling versus descheduling. Oh, and just a plug. So I'm the chair of the of the New York State Bar Association Cannabis Law Section. And we are having a webinar on rescheduling and descheduling on May 7th. So, I'm happy to share that link with Deborah and make sure it gets out to you all, along with a discount code so you can attend for free. So that'll be a really good, informational session about the details regarding descheduling, rescheduling.
We'll make sure that we include that in the email going out with this link so that folks can continue expanding their knowledge around that. Thank you. That's really helpful. I think it also opens the whole conversation around descheduling and rescheduling, also opens the door around public health and where we can do research and how we can do research and who's involved in research and access, not just from sort of a knowledge, attitudes, and belief and sort of assessing where the community is, but really looking at the science of this and the implications. So we will be following that conversation very closely because I know we have some public health folks that are watching this who are thinking about, and are clear, this isn't alcohol, it's not opioids, this is cannabis. And we want to be able to get our public health folks and others ready to be able to address these issues and be cannabis ready in a different sort of way. And having said that, we have another question that's come in, and this one is, can you discuss any of the initiatives or strategies within the industry aimed at promoting social equity and addressing historical injustices? And how those efforts may have, affected been so far? So is there any sort of, I guess, movement afoot around looking at the social equity component? And I think this may have to do also with some of the taxation or the potential for that.
Yeah, so, on the social equity front, I think there have been a lot of lessons sort of learned from seeing some of the earlier rollouts in other states that didn't really prioritize equity. They had exorbitant licensing fees. You had to have a minimum of a couple million sitting in a bank in many states in order to operate very competitive licensing schemes, where you had to fill out these like super long applications and hire lawyers and consultants to help you fill out the forms. So we're seeing a lot of different ways to try to address that. So, even in terms of accessibility of licenses. So, a lot of states early on had limited licensing schemes where there were only a certain number. And, and that's even in New York when they started medically, I think it was only 12 or 10 operators allowed to be cannabis companies in New York, which is extremely limiting. So, New York with adult use, right now, there aren't licensing caps. So that's one way to try to ensure that people are able to at least get their hands on a license, or have the opportunity to. Lower licensing fees, ideally technical assistance and education. I think we'll see more of that as more money comes in, hopefully. But ideally providing free education to entrepreneurs from these communities, because it really is a lot to take on, understanding how to operate a regulated business. So, making sure people have access to the right information so they can make sure they're operating their businesses compliantly, and not lose their businesses is really important. And of course, the most important thing, which is the biggest struggle, is access to capital. So, whether it's loans or grants, low interest loans or grants, New York really has had kind of tried it with the conditional adult use retail program, which was set up to provide people who had previous cannabis convictions with retail businesses. That has been, very bumpy and challenging. It's not entirely clear that people from those populations have gotten access to the funding that they were supposed to for building out their dispensaries, but the intent was there. So we have a lot of the models for it. It's just a matter of implementing it effectively, which I think is challenging. But I do think in terms of, again, the intent of the MRTA, that they really did try to bake in the social equity component in New York, at least.
Thank you. Cecilia, so there's another question here about, from a workforce development perspective, sort of the difference between for-profit and nonprofit. And I think the question that I'm looking at here, that I'm getting a text from somebody who's online, is, so what is the role of nonprofit and how do they incorporate workforce into the current work that they're doing? So I think that they're speaking to like social workers, caseworkers. How does an organization begin to look at their existing work policies to incorporate this new legislation and ensure that they're keeping up with the new policies?
So, sorry, I want to make sure I understand the
I think
question.
there's a difference. I think folks are thinking about for-profit and then the nonprofit sector. And I think there's been a lot of conversation about how for-profit integrates this this new legislation into ensuring that employees have these rights and that they understand what is sort of the thoughts that a nonprofit has to take into consideration, since they're providing social services. They have social workers, caseworkers. We haven't really talked a lot about what that looks like. And do you have some thoughts about that?
Yeah, I mean, so a couple of thoughts. I mean, I think in terms of like the populations that they serve, I think really making sure that like attending programming like this to really get an understanding of kind of what the implications are so that they can advise their clients well on it. But in terms of developing their own workplace policies around some of these new changes, as a nonprofit entity, you're still responsible. If you have employees, you still are required to follow state law, federal law, and local laws when it comes to employment, whether it's cannabis related or not. So, whatever sort of mechanisms or, if they have people internally who are responsible for developing their human resources policies, you really want to make sure that they're keeping an eye on this and making sure that if there are any updates that are required to their policies, that they're aware of it and, making those changes and just making sure that they have a policy for, whether it's drug testing or anything like that.
Thank you. Let's see. We have another question coming in that says, in your opinion, what narratives or myths about cannabis perceive in contemporary society, and how might challenging or reframing these narratives shape the future of cannabis policy and culture?
That's a great question. So I think one of the myths that persists is like the idea of like the lazy stoner, like people who use weed aren't productive citizens in society. And that couldn't be further from the truth. And I think that, with the medical movement and, people really realizing that for many people, it's medicine. And even for those who are recreational, it's becoming more and more normalized. I try to be, as an attorney, and a breast cancer survivor, I use cannabis medicinally. And so I think just being authentic and sharing my experience, I hope that, and, encourage other people who, are in professions that may not stereotypically be associated with a cannabis user, just, show up and be like, I use cannabis and I have a mortgage. Like, what I mean? Like, I'm still an adult who handles my responsibilities. And I think it's just a matter of becoming more and more normalized. And I think one of the things, not to go completely off tangent, and my hope is that with seeing these, when we start to see more legal stores operating and a more regulated industry, I think people will start to really kind of just see it as, it'll kind of be like, as it is in California, just like something that's just a part of the culture, but the sky hasn't fallen. They're not like, teenagers strung out on cannabis in the streets. Like life is still going on. And, I also do think that communities that start to see more tax revenue come in from it, that might be also another way where we'll see other communities that may not have been as cannabis friendly, at least for the economic benefits, kind of become more, amenable to having cannabis operators within their jurisdictions. But yeah, definitely the lazy stoner is, I think, a persistent stereotype, or, people who use it are drug addicts and, that kind of thing. Like there is still a stigma around it for sure. But it's, we're making progress, I think, on that front, and I've been really pleased to see even members of the religious community, like Emmanuel Baptist Church in Brooklyn, really providing space to have these conversations, among religious people about, cannabis and all of that, So I think that that's another way to kind of help break the stigma, is if we bring all these different communities together to really demystify it.
Cecilia, thank you for sharing your personal story. I know that sometimes that's not always the most comfortable, but I appreciate you sharing that with us and giving us an insight into that. And big ups to Emmanuel, because they have always been on the cutting edge in terms of creating safe spaces for these conversations. This is just sort of the beginning of the conversations around what it means to be a professional and using cannabis for your medical or recreational. And so I think creating sort of these safe spaces like in Brooklyn, here in Harlem, bringing the cross-section of professionals together to continue these conversations is really critical. Looking ahead, what are some of the potential scenarios or trends you envision for the American cannabis industry in the coming years? And what implications might these scenarios have on the larger society?
Great question. Well, where do I start? Well, I think, my hope is that I do feel that one of the pieces that keeps kind of getting lost is the fact that people are still in prison for this. And I think that as it becomes more, like once you have it federally legal, like it's just I think that'll be the breaking point where hopefully we'll actually get people out of prison for this. And I think that federal legalization will really be a game changer. I do have concerns about what that could mean for small businesses. And it doesn't mean, that it shouldn't be federally legal, but I think that we should do it with a mind towards making sure that we are, for those of us advocates who have fought for social equity to have a table in this industry, to make sure that they don't get, kind of swallowed up and lost in all of this. And having to now compete with businesses from, every which way, and just, trying to figure out a way to do it in a way that still provides an opportunity for small business owners to thrive, I think is really important.
You've got another one coming in that says, beyond the immediate effects on the cannabis business, how might the martyr in New York State influence broader workforce dynamics, including employment opportunities, workforce culture, and labor rights?
So I think that labor has really had a strong voice in crafting the MRTA, and as I mentioned earlier on, the labor peace agreement component. So ensuring that workers have a choice to unionize if they want. And I think that being able to have come together and have employees advocate for themselves is really important. And I think that the fact that cannabis licensees are required to sort of sit on their hands in the event their workers do want to unionize is really, really important. And my hope is that, if employers are concerned about unions, that they will make sure that the policies that they're developing are such that they keep their employees feeling happy and fulfilled. And, that will sort of decrease the likelihood of, organizing if that's the concern. But I really do think that unions want the cannabis industry to be successful, because if the businesses aren't successful, then there aren't jobs, and then there aren't workers to unionize. So I really do think that labor is trying to work with businesses to make sure that the employees are being, protected and having their rights respected, and these are good jobs for them, and also allowing the businesses to thrive. But I do think there are a lot of opportunities in terms of job creation. It's projected that there'll be at least 50,000 jobs in New York State alone, as the cannabis continue, as the businesses become, standing up, and as the industry grows. So there's a lot of potential there. And, a lot of people may worry, who are interested in entering the industry, about having not had prior cannabis experience. And since it's a new industry, there are a lot of opportunities, even if you haven't had cannabis experience, because they're looking for good workers who have good experience and transferable skills. So we really try to help spread the word about what the opportunities are in cannabis. We have other classes that we offer that provide an industry overview in terms of job outlooks and different types of jobs and things like that. So definitely check out our website for more information about that. But from a workforce perspective, there's a lot of opportunities across the supply chain for people to really come in and get good jobs, from the entry level to higher level paying jobs as well. So it's really is exciting, the idea of job creation that can come about from this industry alone.
And Cecilia, just to that point, I think I just want to add that it's both flower touching and non-flower touching. So there's,
Yes.
we spent a lot of time, or people spend a lot of time talking about the flower touching part of the industry, but there is this whole other workforce lane in terms of the non-flower touching, things like tourism or the role of public health and research. So we're excited to see what that looks like, and thinking through how we step through those sort of hoops to really expand our workforce here in New York State.
Absolutely.
We do have time for one more question. I know we've been sort of hitting you with questions. We'll give you one more that we've got, and then want to give you an opportunity to give sort of closing statements or sort of takeaways. And the last one here is, what proactive measures can employees and policymakers take to ensure a smooth transition and equitable outcomes for workers affected by changes in the cannabis legislation?
I think just being in conversation and, continuing to, from the labor perspective, advocacy is so important, continuing to talk to legislatures, talk to your, local representatives, let them know, the issues that workers are facing, so that, when it comes time to legislative session, if there's any laws that need to be implemented or changed, that can happen. But I think it's really just continuing having that open dialogue and continuing to communicate, whatever needs that employees might be having is really important, and that's one of the things we emphasize is just open communication. And even just, in terms of at the workplace itself, a lot of things could be avoided with just being able to have civil dialogue about certain things. And that's one of the things that we're trying to teach people too, is just like communication skills around that and that sort of thing. So I think we all have the same goal, which is to see the industry be successful. So it's just, continuing to have the conversations, I think is really important. And educating the legislatures.
Fabulous. All right, Cecilia, what's the take home? What do you want us to do? How do we make this better?
Well, I definitely want you to spread the word about the Cannabis Workforce Initiative and we offer free programming and in a time when the industry is still kind of getting up and running, this is really the time to take advantage as much as you can of the educational opportunities, whether it's with us, whether it's with CUNY, with all these academic institutions that are now getting more and more involved in the cannabis space. So definitely check out our website, cannabisworkforce.org. And we have classes there, resources, please spread the word. Because we really want to make sure that we're getting our message out there. And I'm really glad you brought up the point about non-plant touching, because that's one of the things that's really exciting about this industry is just all the opportunities, even outside of just touching the plant, that can really grow from this, whether it's, being a small business that sets up some sort of tourism, you could have weed hotels, who knows, like the possibilities are really endless in some regards. So I think it's just a really exciting time, and there's just so much potential there. So I definitely encourage people to keep an eye on things and encourage others to do the same. And this is an industry that really is trying to be, I guess you could say, sort of professionalized, with the understanding that culture is what got us here. So, not losing sight of that, but, making it so that it's accessible for people who don't have any kind of prior experience with cannabis.
Thank you, Cecilia. Please know that you always have a space here with us as
Thank
we
you.
are continuing our work. We'd love to have you come back as the law is changing and as the issues arise to continue to address from a labor perspective. And we're always grateful to CWI for the partnership in being able to educate our community. So thank you very much and really appreciate your time, your energy, and your talents. Thank you all for joining us for this conversation. Please remember that you're eligible for continuing education credits. And the team here would love for you to be able to finish a small poll. You can take it for those that are on Zoom. It should be popping up on your screen. For others, you can look at the QR code and tap in, but we'd really like to know how we're gauging in terms of the design of these programs. Our Cannabis Equity webinar series is continuing and will go through as the legislation is changing. We're looking at the science of cannabis from medical to adult use, and the School of Public Health will continue to sit in a space where we're hoping to create safe spaces for hard conversations. Next slide. And as always, we want to thank our partners. Cecilia, thank you. I can't tell you how wonderful it has been to have you sort of lay out the history for us. So Cannabis Workforce Initiative, big ups. We appreciate you. We'll make sure that in the thank you, your website is there. They have great resources, great training programs. Community boards 9, 10, 11, 12. Thank you for your continued support, and the Cannabis Equity Task Forces, Cultivating Community Foundation, the New York Cannabusiness Chamber of Commerce, Mixxy's Blossom. We thank you all, and most of all, the School of Public Health and our Dean, Dr. Ayman El-Mohandes, who has created space for this conversation. And our goal is really this. It's about helping us find the science in cannabis so that we can create the next set of cannabis-ready public health leaders. So thank you on behalf of that. Upcoming events. As most folks know, this Saturday is 420. And so there will be events all over the city that will be commemorating 420 right here in the village of Harlem. The School of Public Health, Community Board 10, Harlem Business Alliance, and others will be doing the 3rd annual Higher Learning Cannabis Conference. It is available to everyone, free. It's on 120th Street at the corner of Malcolm X. So come join us. We'll be having panel discussions. May 1st, we will be joining community boards 9, 10, 11, and 12 and 100 Black men. Harlem Hospital CAB will be talking about the state of mental health in Harlem with a focus on anxiety and depression. And then May 9th, the School of Public Health will be doing a blood drive right here in the village of Harlem. You can find all of these events on our Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn, or our bulletin. So please use the QR codes. Please follow us. Please let us know if these webinars are what you want and what you need. And also, please feel free to send us ideas for the next set of webinars. Thank you again, everyone. Cecilia, thank you so much. We'll be following you on social media, and you can follow us for the next set of events. On behalf of the Harlem Health Initiative team, Priya, Araceli, Tamisha, thank you very much for all of your hard work in making this successful. And Cecilia has dropped in her tag, so make sure you get that, and we'll include that also. Stay tuned. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, everyone. Happy 420.
Happy 420. Thank you.